U.S. versus Sean Combs after lunch, afternoon update from day 8. I waited till I got home. And I want to go back to the morning just for a second when the HSI special agent was testifying. I want to point out that both the government and the defense, they referenced the indictment a few times. The government referenced the indictment mainly to cross-check the evidence that they were showing us. And the defense, they referenced the indictment to show that some of the drugs that were found, certain pills like MDMA or whatever else, there was such a small amount that they were destroyed, the drugs or the pills. And I say small amount because it didn't say that exactly, but it said something along those lines. And the defense really wanted to make that clear, like, oh, there was such a little amount of drugs here that, the government was able to destroy them. Anyway, I also want to point out that in the morning, Dr. Dawn Hughes, she talked a lot about trauma bonding and how trauma bonding works. And she explained, she went in detail about that. Oh, and then she talked a lot about PTSD because she worked with veterans and how memories are recovered, after the fact, and how PTSD, affects some of these memories. Wow, I can't talk. It's been a day. And I gotta say, it was, the testimony from, I guess, all 3 witnesses today was kind of long. The first 2 more so because HSI and, an expert, Dr. Dawn Hughes, some of that testimony can be a little bit tedious, I guess. And I think that, people were feeling it. I mentioned everybody looked kind of tired at one point. But going back to the cross, which was done by a new attorney we hadn't seen before, Jonathan Bach, he really seemed to focus on one thing, and this is what caused a lot of the sidebars and a lot of the objections. But he said she did this webinar or this presentation 10 years prior with this other doctor, and it was basically, it was called Expert Witness Testimony in Cases Involving Domestic Violence. So he said, you were training people on how to testify in court. And she's like, well, not necessarily how to testify in court, but, how you should conduct yourself on the stand. And then he actually went through this. He's looking through, this document, and the sidebar was about the court putting the document on the screen for the jury. But the judge was like, no, you don't need to put this on the screen, because initially Dr. Hughes said she didn't really remember it. And the judge said if she doesn't remember, you can give her the physical copy and she can look at it, but the jury doesn't need to see this. And like I said, there was a lot of sidebars. And during the sidebars, by the way, they play white noise, and the judge made a joke. He was like, I feel like we need to get some music instead of this white noise. Sorry about that. Apologize to the jury. Okay, so then he after this back and forth about the training or the webinar, he said, so most of your income comes from court-related work, would you say? And she's like, no. And he's like, well, how does that work? What's, clinical versus court? And she said, well, it's 60-40. Court, 60, clinical, 40. And he's like, so that's most of it. And she's like, oh, yeah. And then what did he say? Oh, he went on to talk about her meetings with the government and how there were 6 to 8 meetings. And she described herself as a blind witness. So he was kind of like or a blind expert. He's like, if there's 6 to 8 meetings, why do you need that many if you're a blind expert and you don't know the details of the case, you don't know the survivors or the victims? And she said, it was just a meeting or meetings so we could sort of educate the government on how the jury should hear certain things about this, about trauma and about abuse. And, he pointed something out where he said she updated an outline for the government, and he's like, so, you are working in favor of the government here. You're updating outlines for them. And she's like, no, I'm working in favor of science. And he said, well, the science doesn't pay you, right? The DOJ pays you. And I think there was an objection there, and he said withdrawn. Now, during the redirect, the government asked Dr. Hughes, have you ever worked for the defense before? Or, have you ever worked on the side of the defense? And she's like, yeah. And then she said, have you ever worked for any of these defense attorneys, pointing at Diddy's team? And she said, yes. And then during the recross, Bach got up And what did he say? Okay, he pointed out, he said, so you worked with Brian Steele. And I actually guessed this. We're not allowed to talk in the courtroom, but I wrote it down on my pad of paper, and I showed it to another reporter, and I was like, it's Steele. And she was like, yeah. And so he said, you were contacted by Brian Steele to testify on behalf of a woman who said she was a domestic violence victim, and she shot her husband in the head 5 times. And then Dr. Hughes was like, look, I'm not really comfortable talking about this because I didn't testify in that trial. And he said, yes, because Dr. Steele decided not to call you as a witness. He decided not to hire you. There was definitely an objection there, and then a withdrawn. That was a little bit spicy. And then yeah, he was basically done after that. But Dr. Hughes, yeah, like I said, there seemed to be a lot of issues, a lot of sidebars, a lot of objections. And at one point during a sidebar, I wish we had a lip reader, because Diddy turned around to his sons, Justin and Christian, who were there, and he said something to them for probably 10 seconds. And I was dying to know what it was. I couldn't really tell, but yeah. Okay, so then the last witness we saw the day, who was questioned by Maureen Comey, was George Kaplan. He was a former assistant, and he first worked at Nickelodeon, and then he got moved over to Combs Enterprises. He was an executive assistant to someone at Nickelodeon, who then became COO at Combs Enterprises. And he worked at Combs Enterprises from December 2013 to December 2015. Now, I mentioned he worked for somebody else when he first started in December of 2013. He was the executive assistant to the COO, and then in September of 2014, he got promoted to Sean Combs' executive assistant. But let's remember, he left in December of 2015, just a few months later. He described working 80 to 100 hours per week. And he said over the course of 15 months, he made $120,000. He said a lot of the times when he was working very late, his schedule would run from 9:30 a.m. And he said the earliest he left would be 6 p.m., the latest would be 4 a.m. And he said that when he left late, it was because of late studio recording times, or, nothing salacious, just studio stuff. He talked about working with other assistants. He talked about, his duties, which was carrying bags, packing bags, getting Diddy to different meetings. And then he said setting up hotel rooms. And then he testified that he would set up hotel rooms for Diddy. He would get a hotel bag, and in that bag would be baby oil, candles, Diddy's clothes, corroborating what we already heard. He also said that he would clean up the hotels after Diddy stayed there. And he testified that he would clean up in order to preserve Diddy's reputation, because these hotel rooms, he said there'd be baby oil on the bed, the table, the floor. It was it was baby oil everywhere. He literally said that. He said he bought these supplies when he had to buy them with the corporate credit card. He testified he set up hotel rooms in LA, New York, Miami, and he corroborated the same hotels that we've heard that Diddy stays at. The Trump in New York, the Intercontinental in LA. He also discussed seeing the med bag with different drugs, but he said that he didn't see a lot of drugs besides Tylenol, Advil, and MDMA and ketamine. He didn't really see, he didn't say MDMA. He said he actually had to buy MDMA for Diddy, but he testified that this med bag, he only saw, prescriptions and Tylenol, Advil, and then he said ketamine. So who knows? But he also testified that he did have to buy drugs for Diddy on 2 different occasions, but he was basically given a number to call, and he was given cash. And so he called the number, and then, that's kind of how he got these drugs. And Diddy, or the drug dealer, gave him these instructions. And that's pretty much where we stopped. I'm sure I forgot a few things, but I will try to include it in tomorrow's update if I forgot. All right, thanks for listening.